The letter had sat on Jacob Manning's kitchen table for 3 weeks before he found the courage to open it. 3 weeks of staring at the envelope while he drank his morning coffee, while he ate his solitary supper, while the silence of the cabin pressed against his ears like water in a drowning man's lungs. He had written to the correspondence service on a night when the loneliness had become unbearable, when the walls had seemed to close in around him, and the memory of her face had been so vivid it was almost a hallucination. Now the answer was here, and he was afraid of what it might contain. When he finally tore the envelope open, his hands were shaking hands that had roped cattle and felled timber and built this cabin board by board, trembling over a piece of paper like a schoolboy with his first love letter. The response was brief, typed on a form that hundreds of women had filled out before her. Her name was Eleanor. She was 34. She had been married once, widowed. She was looking for a new beginning, a quiet life, a man who understood what it meant to carry grief and still choose to live. Jacob read the words 3 times, and for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to hope. Their correspondence lasted 6 months. Letters crossed the miles between his ranch in Wyoming and her boarding house in Chicago, each one longer than the last, each one peeling back another layer of the careful armor they had both built around their hearts. She wrote about the lake where she had walked with her late husband, about the book she loved, about a small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. He wrote about the ranch, about the horse that had been his closest companion, about the silence that had become a physical presence in his home. Neither mentioned the photograph the service had offered to send. Neither wanted to reduce the other to an image. The letter proposing marriage was the hardest thing Jacob had ever written. He had proposed to his first wife on a summer evening, young and foolish, and certain that nothing would ever hurt them. Now he sat at the same table, older, wiser, more afraid than he had ever been, and he wrote words that felt like jumping off a cliff. He told her he could promise her a roof, a fire, food on the table. He could promise her respect, companionship, a place to belong. He could not promise her passion. That part of him, he wrote, had been buried with his wife. He sealed the letter before he could change his mind. Her answer arrived faster than any of the others, as if she had been waiting for the question. She would come. She needed no promises of passion, she wrote. She had loved deeply, lost completely, and survived. What she needed was a partner, someone to share the weight of living, someone who understood that sometimes the most profound love was the quiet kind, the kind that asked only for presence and patience. She would take the train west, arriving at Honey Creek Station on the 15th. Jacob read the letter until the paper was soft, and then he went to the barn and sat with his horse, unable to explain to the animal why his eyes kept filling with tears. The morning of the 15th, Jacob woke before dawn and dressed in his best shirt, the one his wife had given him on their 5th anniversary, the one he had not worn since the day they buried her. He brushed his hair, trimmed his beard, stood in front of the small mirror, and did not recognize the man looking back at him. The ranch was quiet, the sun just beginning to paint the horizon, and he stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing the cold morning air, trying to steady the pounding of his heart. Then he saddled his horse and began the long ride into town. The train was late. Jacob stood on the platform of Honey Creek Station, his hat in his hands, watching the empty tracks stretch toward the horizon. The town was waking up around him, the mercantile opening its doors, the blacksmith lighting his forge, a dog trotting across the dusty street. But he existed in a bubble of anticipation that shut out everything else. He had not told anyone about the letter. He had not told anyone she was coming. He had not wanted to explain, to defend, to hear the pity in their voices when they learned he was trying to replace what he had lost. He was not trying to replace anything. He was trying, for the first time in 7 years, to live. The whistle came first, a distant cry that made his chest constrict. Then the black engine appeared around the bend, steam billowing, wheels grinding against the tracks. Jacob's hands tightened around his hat, and he realized he he was holding his breath. The train pulled into the station with a final shuddering exhale, and passengers began to disembark. A farmer with a sack of seed, a young couple with a baby, a woman in a gray traveling dress carrying a carpet bag. Jacob's eyes found her immediately, drawn to her as if by a force he could not name, and then the world seemed to stop. She stood on the platform, looking around with the careful composure of a woman who had learned to hide her uncertainty, and something in Jacob's chest cracked open. It was not recognition, not yet. It was something deeper, something primal, a trembling in his bones that told him everything was about to change. She was taller than he had imagined, her hair darker, her face more angular. But there was something in the way she held herself, the way she turned her head, the way her hands wrapped around the handle of her bag, that sent a shock through him he could not explain. He approached her slowly, his boots sounding too loud on the wooden platform, his heart hammering against his ribs. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, like storm clouds over the prairie. She was older than the woman in his memory, of course. Older than anyone should have to be. But when she spoke, "Mr. Manning?" Her voice was lower than he had expected, rougher, and it struck something in him that he had thought was dead. "Eleanor," he said, and the name felt strange on his tongue, unfamiliar. She smiled, a small, tentative thing that did not quite reach her eyes, and she lifted her hand to push back the hood of her traveling cloak. The morning light caught her face fully for the first time, illuminating the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. The small scar on her left cheek, no, on her left hand. She had written about a scar on her left hand, and Jacob's breath stopped entirely. He stared at her, and something in his chest began to crumble, piece by piece, like a dam that had held for 7 years finally giving way. She saw something shift in his expression, and her smile faltered. "Mr. Manning, are you all right?" Her hand moved toward her face, self-conscious, and that gesture, that small, unconscious gesture of vulnerability, shattered something inside him. He knew that gesture. He had seen it 1,000 times, in a different life, in a different place, on a face that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. His knees buckled, and he reached for the platform railing to steady himself, the wood rough beneath his fingers, the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tipped sideways. Jacob? His name on her lips was different now, uncertain, afraid. She stepped toward him, her hand outstretched, and he looked up at her, into her gray eyes, her familiar, impossible gray eyes, and the words came out of him before he could stop them. "Mary." The name fell into the space between them like a stone into still water, and he watched her face change. Watched the confusion, the recognition, the dawning horror as she understood what he was seeing. She stepped back, her hand rising to her chest, and her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. No, you can't be. But he was. He was the boy she had loved 20 years ago, before the war, before the marriage her parents had forced upon her, before the husband who had taken her east, and the life that had slowly, quietly suffocated her. He was the memory she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it had never been real. She had answered his letter because he sounded kind, because he understood grief, because something in his words had spoken to something in her that she had thought was long dead. She had not known. She had not known. And now she stood on this platform, looking into the face of the only man she had ever truly loved, and the weight of 20 lost years crashed down upon her. The station master had retreated into his office. The platform was empty now. The other passengers gone. The train pulling away toward its next destination. Jacob and Mary Eleanor. She had called herself Eleanor for so long she had almost forgotten her own name, stood facing each other in the sudden silence, the space between them filled with everything they had never said. "You changed your name," he said finally, his voice raw. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. "I wanted to be someone new, someone who had never left you." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them could bear. Jacob took a step toward her, then stopped, afraid of what he might do if he got any closer. "You didn't leave me," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Your parents, they took you. I came to find you after the war. I came to Chicago, but you were already married, already gone." Her hand flew to her mouth, and the tears she had been holding back finally broke free. "You came? You came for me?" He nodded, unable to speak, and something in her expression shifted, grief and joy and fury and love, all tangled together, all 20 years of silence, finally finding voice. They sat on the bench where Jacob had been waiting, side by side, not touching, the carpet bag between them. She told him about her marriage, about a man who had been kind at first and then distant, about the years of loneliness in a house that was never quite home. She told him about the widowhood that had felt less like grief and more like release, about the correspondence service she had answered on a whim, about the letters that had felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was missing. He told her about the ranch, about the wife he had loved and lost, about the 7 years of silence that had followed. Neither mentioned the photograph neither had sent. Neither mentioned the name she had chosen, the one that had brought her back to him. "The scar," Jacob said suddenly, his voice low. "You wrote about a scar on your left hand. From a childhood accident." She looked down at her hand, at the small white line she had carried since she was 12 years old. "I fell out of a tree," she said slowly. "You were there. You carried me home." He nodded, and for the first time since she had lifted her hood, he smiled, a small, broken thing that was more grief than joy, but genuine. "I thought I was dreaming when I read that. I thought I had invented you. All these years, I thought I had invented you." She reached for his hand then, her fingers finding his in the space between them, and he did not pull away. His hand was larger than she remembered, rougher, the hand of a man who had worked the land for 2 decades. But the bones were the same. The shape of his fingers, the warmth of his palm, these were things her body had not forgotten, even when her mind had tried. "I'm not married anymore," she said quietly. "I haven't been married for a very long time." He looked at her, at the woman she had become, at the girl she had been, and he understood. "I know," he said. "I know." The sun had climbed higher, the morning shadows shortening around them, but neither moved to leave the bench. Jacob held her hand in both of his thumb tracing the small scar on her palm, and she let him, her eyes closed, her breath slow and steady. "I didn't order a bride because I wanted to replace anyone," he said finally, his voice so low she almost did not hear him. "I ordered a bride because I was tired of being alone. And then you stepped off that train, and I saw your face, and I realized I had not been waiting for a bride. I had been waiting for you. I think I've been waiting for you my whole life." Eleanor opened her eyes, and in the gray light of a Wyoming morning, she looked at the man she had loved since she was 17 years old, the man she had lost and found again through a twist of fate she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. "I'm not married," she said again, but this time her voice was softer, her hand tightening around his. "But I'm here, and I am not leaving. Not ever again." Jacob raised her hand to his lips, his shoulders shaking with a sob he had been holding for 20 years, and on a dusty platform in a town neither of them had ever seen before. 2 people who had spent a lifetime being pulled apart finally, irrevocably, came home.